Hi there, my name is Cameron Dutro, and I am coming at you today to talk about something that I've been working on for quite a while, about a year now, that is designed to give you reactivity and a bunch of other nice features for developing UI in Rails applications. And I think what I would like to start out by saying is that right now, React is kind of the de facto standard for building UI in any application framework. Rails is one of them. And I say that because every job posting that I see and every company that I've worked for has at one point either considered React or is already using React for their UI on the front end. And I also want to say that this is not about bagging on React at all. I think React is really cool. It's enabled a set of features and functionality on the web that I think wouldn't have been possible otherwise. It's got a great developer experience. It's got a wonderful ecosystem. TypeScript has made it even more powerful in the recent past. And so this is not about being mean to React. This is simply about wanting to think about the Rails front end more holistically and wonder if we can evolve past what we currently have in the Rails ecosystem for developing UI. Now, what we're going to look at today is adding a couple of counters, or I guess I'd call them stopwatches, to this crossword application that I'm building. This crossword application is not designed to be production ready necessarily. It's just a fun experiment slash research opportunity for me. I just needed something real, and I like crosswords, and so I thought I would build this and see if I could get it to work the way I want it to, and develop the UI for it in a way that I liked and felt comfortable with, that was not necessarily using React. You'll also notice that it's called to-do list 2, and this also should be an indication. This is just a research project. At some point, I would like to publish all this stuff, but right now, this is just kind of um, my little test bed for experimentation as I work through some of these problems and figure out what I want on the front end. So the first thing I'd like to say is just give some of my background here. I guess the first thing was talking about React. The second thing is to give some of my background. I've been in the Rails world for 15 years or so. I started in around 2010 when I worked for Twitter, back when Twitter was still a big Rails application, and I was there while they converted that to Scala. And sort of cut my teeth in that world and saw how powerful Rails was, and just totally fell in love with it and with Ruby, and have sort of wanted to continue doing that my whole career. Most recently, I work at GitHub, and one of my big jobs at GitHub was maintaining the primer view components framework, and also the view component framework, the primer view components library of components, and also being a co-maintainer of the view component framework, which I've also contributed to. One of the things that I noticed, because Primer has view components, but it also has Primer React components, and of course those are very different worlds. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is sort of born out of all of the research and work and thinking and playing around that I've done, not only in my free time but also as a part of the GitHub Primer team. So I'll just close this tab. We don't need to talk about view components anymore, but this is just FYI. It's a cool library of view components. Um, I should also mention what view component is. View component is a framework for developing UI that was built by Joel Hoxley from GitHub, and it's really cool. If you haven't checked it out at all yet, I can go to the repo here, and there's also a view component or website you can check out view component and see how it works. I think though that we're all sort of, at least in the front end world, we're all sort of convinced at this point that components are a good idea. I think we're also have convinced ourselves that reactivity is a good idea, specifically signals. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So yeah, that's where I'm coming at this from, is this standpoint of wanting to make the Rails UI paradigms better and more powerful, and also sort of standing on the shoulders of giants here, such as Joel and others that have been pioneering UI development in Rails. So let's take a look at our crossword application. It's pretty straightforward. So I can click on these cells and that will change the direction that I'm typing. Number of fingers in a peace sign is 2. Get a grip. On the lookout is alert. bit of DNA is a gene and comes to a close, ends. And you can see that like once I've solved the whole thing, I get like a little splash of confetti and I'm done. If you've ever played the crossword app or played crosswords in the Apple News app, there's an Apple News app, and inside that there's a crossword um, little game, sort of mini app. And there's a mini crossword and there is a full crossword that they publish every day. And one of the things that that app does is has a little stopwatch that runs on some part of the UI. And as the first letter you type, that stopwatch will start, and it will count up the amount of seconds it's taken you to complete the puzzle. And so, what I want to do is implement that in this crossword app as well. So if I wonderful. Yes, actually, this is great. So what this is telling me is that I don't have digit.rux, and this is maybe where we can start, because I've deleted all the files that I want to implement with you. I've already implemented this. I'm going to do it with you now. So we will go, first of all, to our code editor, and I'm going to stop the server for now. I'm using Vite, and I'm using PostCSS to build all of the assets that this depends on. The first thing that I want to bring to your attention is sort of the structure of this application. So all of the UI is built with components, and it's not built with Vue components. It's actually built with Neato components. Neato is the framework that I'm sort of building that, and again, I don't know if this will be a framework or a library or what this will be at the end of the day. But for now, I'm just calling it Neato. It's got a bunch of files in it that help you build UI. And one thing you might notice is that this file is in Ruby. This file executes on the front end. It runs in your browser. It's compiled to JavaScript via the Opal project. I actually tried a bunch of different ways of getting Ruby to run on the front end, including trying ruby.wasm, which is this super interesting and super cool way of running a real Ruby compiled to WASM in your browser. For various reasons, that turned out not to work as well as I wanted it to, and so I explored other options, including writing my own implementation of the R virtual machine in TypeScript, which of course is not complete, but also it turned out to be too not really what I was looking to. I wanted something more fully functional that was already built and working, and so I started to look at Opal. Opal really is maybe one of the most impressive projects that I've ever seen. It's so feature complete that it like surprised me when I started using it. I thought for sure there would be some rough edges or places where it wasn't exactly the same as Ruby. And to a large degree, I think that that's not true. It works flawlessly. It's almost exactly the same as MRI. There are a couple of very minor differences between the two, but for the most part, I was blown away by like how much compatibility there is between the two, between MRI and Opal. The transpilation process is fast. It runs in the browser because it uses native types for strings and hashes and things like that. It's also like efficient and fast, and it's really not too heavyweight either. So you might be thinking like, if I'm going to ship a UI to clients in their browser, I want it to not be super heavyweight. And while Opal does add a bunch to your bundle, it's not as much as I thought, and so I think it's a much more viable solution than I thought. So like WASM, for example, I was able to get down to I think 12 megabytes or something of WASM binary code that you have to download and run in your browser, and this is much less than that. So that's also really a positive sort of pro in the Opal column. You sort of get both efficiency and a relatively small bundle size. I'm not saying it's very small. I'm just saying it's relatively small bundle size. So yeah, that's kind of what that's the first part of this. And then if we go back to our editor here, I'll just describe some of the rest of this here. So each component, so this is the game component. Each component you just include this Neato component module. There's the concept of state, just like you might have in a React component. And then down here, just like you also would do in a React component or maybe a Vue component, the call method is where you define your template. And you might be noticing in here that instead of having ERB tags in here or literal text or whatever else, what I'm using is what looks like HTML tags. And this is enabled by this project that I worked on that actually got me hired at GitHub a long time ago called Rux, and I can pull that up here. Rux is just JSX for Ruby, and this was originally written for Rails apps and to render view components. If I scroll down, you can see some of the examples in here. So we have our name component, and normally you'd have this is the name component plus its template. We can convert this and put these tags in here, and there's not really all I have done here is just renamed the file from .rb to .rux, and then I inlined the template here, and I can now render this just as I would any other view component. It uses a technique in development where it will intercept requires to certain files, and if it notices that file has a Rux extension, then it will automatically transpile it before it gets required into the interpreter. So that's how that works. In production, it doesn't do that. Of course, that would be insane. But that's sort of the basis of this whole thing is Rux. And you can see that not only can I render view components, or in this case, a Neato component, so it's called stack, and board component, I can also render individual HTML elements and pass them attributes and things like that. You may also notice that it enables, or that I can also pass lambdas, like Ruby lambdas, to attributes. So in this case, board component, there's three properties or attributes that it's accepting. One is called onSquareFilled, and this is a callback function, or an anonymous function that gets called when a square is filled in. And what this is doing is simply calling this onSquareFilled function that is set on my game component. So it's a private method. You can see that I'm defining this in Ruby, and all that I needed to do is just pass this lambda here, and every time that the board component calls this function, it also then calls my function here, and I can do set state to running, for example. And there's lots of other sort of nice, I would say, easy to read Ruby functions in here that enable the whole game experience that we just saw. So this brings me to one, I think, of the major points that or one of the major things that I've set out to solve, or at least research with Neato and with all this thinking I've been doing about UI in Rails, and that is continuity. So in most UI frameworks, you're using JavaScript, and having to switch from Ruby to JavaScript, not a huge deal. Maybe Ruby to TypeScript is a little bit more of a jump. Not terrible, and I also, just to be clear, I really like TypeScript. TypeScript is awesome. It's super powerful. I love the types system that they've built into it. It's just really nice. That being said, I like Ruby better, and I also just recognize the amount of sort of cognitive overhead that it takes to switch between not only languages, but also files, right? So not only in the case of React or something else do I have a backend to think about, I also have my components, I have my CSS, I have the behavior potentially in that component. Maybe there's some behavior on the backend. When something updates, I need to transmit or broadcast potentially that change to my front end. There's lots of moving parts, lots of different files. And a lot of what I have tried to do with Neato is to combine all of those things into a single file, or at least a file with some sidecar files. By sidecar, I mean a file that's named the same thing as the Ruby file, but with a different extension. So in the case that I'm showing here, we have board component, and we also have board component.module.css. So that's a module.css is a sidecar file. And I'll talk more about CSS modules in Neato in a few minutes. In any case, so that's Rux. That's sort of the guiding philosophy is to maintain this continuity between your backend Rails app and your front end. And there's also just, I think, a lot to be said for for keeping things nice and neat, right? I mean, one thing that I noticed about like watching people do even hotwire development in Rails, you're really flipping back and forth between a lot of files, a lot of languages, and you're also having to add all these IDs everywhere and whatnot. And that to me doesn't feel nearly as productive as React. Like React is super nice because you don't have to do that kind of thing. All of the wiring between your components is handled by the framework itself, and there's no sort of selecting IDs and manipulating things. It just, in fact, that's kind of why I've said before that Stimulus and Hotwire feel like just maybe a half step above jQuery. There's just, and that's why the world has sort of taken to React, and why React is kind of eating the web development world, because it prevents you from having to do all of that manual work and making sure all your IDs are correct, and matching on IDs like that. It's just a much more, I would say, seamless and holistic development experience, and that's what I'm trying to do here with Neato as well. Okay, so with that out of the way, there's one last thing I want to touch on before we actually dive into writing some code here, and that is Solid. So another thing that I think we all sort of agree on, I mentioned this before, about modern front end development is that reactivity is also really good. Like, we want our websites to be, highly dynamic in many cases. Not all the time. Obviously, lots of websites, lots of pieces of websites, or even entire websites can be static, and that's fine. And there's generally like very, I think, good separation in most cases between static and dynamic content on your website. However, that being said, many websites do need at least some amount of dynamic content on them, whether that's this thing like the select panel like we have in Prime Review Components, or if that's like this demo that I just gave for the crossword application. There's a dynamic dynamic component to that where you type in from your keyboard, and that will fill in the squares that you are seeing on the screen. So dynamic and sort of responsive web applications, like, that ship has sailed. We're definitely, in that world all the way now. I think there's no point in denying that. And also, it's just, I would say, in many cases leads to a nicer experience, a more rich experience, more content, or a better way to display your content, and that sort of is delightful to use. And Solid is one framework that I kind of have been sleeping on for a while, and I've tried a bunch of other ones. I tried to use Lit with web components. I tried to use React at one point, but I finally landed on Solid for the reactivity behind Neato, because not only is it small, it's kind of just another very small step above React and how it works. So Solid does not re-render on every prop change like React would do. What Solid does is provides a very similar API to what you might be experiencing or might be used to with React, but everything is static, and it very intelligently modifies the existing DOM to match whatever changes you've made to the state or to the template of your component. That seemed like a really nice and efficient way of doing UI, and I have also discovered via some research that Solid is also, I think, in many cases 30% faster or so than React, because of how much less it's doing behind the scenes. So yeah, that's Neato. It's Rux. It's Ruby compiled to JavaScript. It's Rux for the templating, and it's Solid for the reactivity. That is kind of the bread and butter of Neato. There are other features too, like it integrates seamlessly with Rails, and makes it easy to build bundles for whatever parts of your page or parts of your website you need. It also provides access to a CSS modules feature. So there's lots of, and it also has an API built into it that lets you talk to your Rails backend. There's lots of sort of stuff that I'm researching and thinking about here, but that's kind of the bread and butter. That's kind of the big, like, headliner feature. It's reactive, and you can write Ruby for the front end. Okay, so let's actually write some code and try to get this working. I'm going to actually stop the recording so that I can just make sure everything's working, and then I'll jump back into it. All right, so let's jump into adding these stopwatches to the right-hand side next to the grid here. So you might have noticed that I got the app working again. All I had to do was restart the server because I had deleted some files, and it didn't realize that they thought those files were still around. So restarting it refreshed the bundle, and we're back up and running. So let's go back to our editor. You can see my server running here. I've also got post CSS running here, and I've got Vite running in the other tab up here. Vite, of course, being for JavaScript, and post CSS for CSS. By the way, I've tried to architect Neato such that you don't actually need to worry about what bundler you're using, both for JavaScript and for CSS. It tries to emit bundler agnostic files that any bundler can take, any bundler can use. what that has meant sort of in practice is that I'm emitting ES modules. So there's that sort of requirement. Your code needs to be compatible with ES modules for to use Neato. And then for CSS, there's sort of not any fancy features involved. It's just plain old CSS. And I think that modern CSS is good enough that we don't really need a lot of Sass or any transforms anymore. Now, that of course, I'm sure there's lots of opinions about that. I'm sure people are going to disagree with me about that. I'm not really a big CSS person. I know enough to be dangerous with CSS, but I'm not like a trained CSS maximalist or whatever. So I tend to think whatever sort of is good enough in regular CSS is good enough for me. But whatever bundler you want to use, you want to add additional features, that's also a possibility. I'm just using post CSS because it's really easy to configure. Okay, so here's our Rails server. So there's three things. We have JavaScript via Vite, CSS via post CSS, and here's our Rails server running in the third tab. I'm gonna hide my terminal here. Okay, so we've got our board component. We're not going to worry about that. That part's already built. The next thing we're looking at is to add our stopwatches. So I think this is probably a good time to talk about the stack component. This is something that we're going to use extensively in this demo. One thing you can see up here is that there's also a cool feature in Neato where I can tell the framework like where my component can render. In this case, there's nothing specific about this component. It's just generating HTML like a normal component would do on the Rails backend. And so I can render this on both the client and the server. There are, of course, components that would only render on one or the other, depending on kind of what feature set they're targeting. If they have browser-specific code in them, then those would be client only, et cetera, et cetera. What the stack component does is really pretty simple. It just wraps it just makes it easy to use the Flexbox CSS feature, I guess you call it. So it'll set display flex on a div, and then you can set gap and flex direction and alignment and things like that. And it's just a nice, convenient way of like setting borders, or not borders, gaps and whatnot, to make layout more straightforward. So I'm happy to provide the code for that if anybody's curious. It's not, I haven't done a lot of thinking about that. I just needed something, and so I whipped that up. There is something also like the stack component. Actually, it is called the stack component in Primer View Components, which is a little bit more fleshed out if you want to take a look at that. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, oh, and by the way, in VS Code here, there's a Rux extension that's giving me the syntax highlighting here. You can tell it's not perfect. I need to fix that, but it's good enough, and I think it works mostly pretty well. It lets you mix like Ruby and HTML, I guess, like syntax. So you can see that the Ruby parts are highlighted with Ruby syntax highlighting, and the HTML parts are highlighted with HTML syntax highlighting. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create another stack component here, an instantiation of that. Direction equals column, and gap equals large. Okay, and then inside that, we're going to do the same thing. And by the way, I'm just copying and pasting from the existing time that I wrote this. And so it might look a little bit less than, stream of consciousness because it's already been done. I'm not a super good streamer. I apologize for that, or video recorder. But hopefully you get the idea. We'll see why this is necessary in a second. Okay, so next thing, we'll have a label, and the first stopwatch we're going to add is an elapsed stopwatch. This is the one that runs as you're typing. So we'll use the label component this is just a really thin wrapper around the label element, and provides these nice size options and whatnot here. Okay, there's our label, and then I'm just going to, for now, I'm just going to stick some text in here and say foo. And now if we go back to our browser, we should hopefully see foo appear. Yep, there it is. And if we look at this, we can see that, I'll try to resize this. You can see that we've got our div, display flex, and then label in here. So just like we might expect. This is also a good opportunity to talk about how Neato works with rendering parts of your page static and parts dynamic. If you want to render a a client-side component, and you're rendering it on the server, what it will do is emit this Neato island web component, custom element. And there's props. You can pass through props from Ruby to JavaScript, and does this by encoding it in this special, I guess you would call it like a special data structure, JSON encoded data structure. And we're seeing here also the data class name is game, and so what the JavaScript will do is find a Ruby class called game, and it will instantiate that, and then that component using Solid will render all of this HTML dynamically inside the island's children. All right, so we're looking pretty good. We've got our label. And actually, what I want to say in here is I should just say elapsed here. And I'll put this on its own line. And now we need the actual stopwatch. So I'll make a new stack. And you can see how this is kind of working here. If I don't specify direction, direction is row. And so I have sort of columns here, and I've got rows. I'm going to do rows right now to lay out the stopwatch itself, the digits, and then next to that is going to be a pause button. And so we'll see that in a second here. I'm going to align this center as well. And then in here, I'm going to render a component called stopwatch. We haven't built this yet. This is just sort of a placeholder. I'm going to give it a class name of elapsed stopwatch so I can target it later. And that's actually not super important. That's just for mostly for debugging purposes, so I can see which one I rendered here. And let's keep that. We'll just do this for now. Just close this off here. Null avoid element. I'm going to not render the pause button, and actually I'm going to say running equals true so we can see it running. If I go and refresh now, you can see that it will just run, like load forever, and that's because in the console we should see, yes, cannot load such file stopwatch. What's cool is this is actually a Ruby error, and we're going to see, of course, like a lot of JavaScript, a lot of Opal in here, but we can also see that there should be Ruby files mentioned in here as well. Oh, it looks like there's not. Okay. Oh no, here we go. So game.rb, for example, if I click on this, you can see this is the part of the compiled template that failed. One thing that I tried to sort of make seamless in Neato is that if something breaks, there are source maps available that will map the problem back to actual Ruby code, and you should be able to like step through your Ruby code with the browser debugger to find out what's wrong and print out version, like you can also print out values of the variables and things like that, like you normally would. Okay, so that's obviously because we don't have a stopwatch component. So we'll go into our components and we'll say stopwatch.rux. And inside stopwatch.rux, we can start to create our stopwatch component. So I will do class stopwatch, and of course we need to, let's set our VS Code. I haven't configured this yet. To do 2 spaces. Inside here we can include our Neato component. This one renders on the client only. And let's create our initializer. And we will also define our template. I'll fill that in later. Def call here. Here's our Rux template in here. I'm going to just do a div wrapper for now and render the digit component. We'll define that in a second as well. So we really need 3 digits, or 3 groupings of digits, one for minutes, one for seconds, and then one for milliseconds. So I'll just do that right here like this. These 2 right here are for, so the minutes, right, has just 1 digit, seconds has 2 digits, and then milliseconds has 1 digit. It's actually, I guess, tenths of seconds. Okay, so we will also now wire up the props that we're taking in here. So one sort of interesting thing about what I've discovered about this, one of the sort of interesting realizations that I had when building this is that in order to sort of maintain reactivity, we unfortunately can't really just let Ruby objects, in this case these components, we can't just accept parameters like we would in a normal constructor or initializer, because if those change, the UI needs to change as well. And I was having trouble figuring out like how to sort of create an ergonomic interface to do that while also maintaining these sort of Ruby idioms that we all know and maybe love. Which is, so I would love in initialize to just accept a bunch of keyword arguments or positional arguments, and then those can become my properties. I just couldn't figure out a good way of doing that. And so instead, I settled on this this class method called prop. And so what we do now, as opposed to accepting, normally you'd accept like an elapsed seconds, I guess it would be milliseconds. Normally you'd accept something like this, and this would be like a number, right? Instead, you declare that by saying prop elapsed msecs. And I'm going to say as, which means I can alias it. I can alias it to init elapsed msecs, because I want to also have a method called elapsed msecs. We'll see that in a second. And then default, it's just going to be 0. We also have our running prop that I had before. We can see that back here. I said running true. So we'll say prop running. I can alias that as running question mark because it's a Boolean, and then default false. And the last one, if I want to pass in some class names, we can do that too. Attach some classes to this thing. Okay, awesome. So we have our props, we have our stopwatch, we've got a really basic template here. The next thing we're going to do is set up some state. So there is a method in Neato component, also similar to what sort of older React components would use, called setState. And this just takes a bunch of keyword arguments. In this case, I'm going to say elapsed msecs. This is going to just be the init elapsed msecs. And once, so that's what we only really need one bit of state. Elapsed, like how many seconds have elapsed since the button was pressed or since the thing was started. But what that enables us now to do is define a bunch of methods. And what I'm going to do is just copy and paste these methods. And you can see what they are pretty soon. This is pretty cool that like we just can do this because it's Ruby, right? So we have minutes, seconds, the tens position in seconds, and the ones position, right? So just lots of little tiny methods like you're really used to seeing in Ruby programs. Milliseconds, tens, right? And then we can just take this information and we can sort of cram it into our template as method calls. So we haven't defined the digit component yet, but one prop that it takes is number. So number can be, for this top one, this first one, minutes. Okay, and then we can stick for, number equals, for this middle, this is the tens, seconds, tens, and this is number equals seconds, ones, and finally our milliseconds here, ms tens. This should really be tenths. These are not great names, but as I said, this is mostly for research. And then we want to have little colons between them, and so we can say div class. There's another, say dots in here. Okay, and then we can do the same thing between the milliseconds and the seconds. Okay, so that's pretty simple what we have here, and this is really just like, I would say the basic. I haven't done everything we need to do yet to make this look good. But it's pretty nice that I can just reuse these components right here in the Rux code, and then have these little methods down here that allow me to, define this behavior right here in Ruby. Little methods here, and then you can also see the corollary to setState is getState. I'm just passing the same symbol that I passed to setState, and this is where all the rest of these are derived from. All right, so that's pretty close to what we need. Let's go define the digit component. And I'm just going to copy paste this one because of time. This is already taking longer than I wanted it to. Okay, so here's the digit component. Oh, and of course my stupid... Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, is that right? Yeah, set our spaces to 2. So in this case, it's actually, it's not super obvious or necessary to talk about how the digit component works. I actually copied this from a code pen that defines this really nice looking digit. I guess you just, yeah, this really nice digit using just HTML elements and CSS. So no SVG or anything like that. And the way that the CSS for this works is each of this parts. So like I think there's what are these, 8 of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, 7 of these, and each of these makes up a little part of the digit. It's supposed to look like one of those digital readouts, like you might see on an old microwave, for example. And what we're saying here is the digit map is just mapping these numbers to their textual equivalent, and so the class is going to be digit, and then whatever that number is. So if you want to display a 0, we would have the 0 class attached to our div here, and that would determine which of these is visible and which is not, and that's how it displays the numbers. This is a great time though to talk about CSS modules. So you can also see that in here I'm saying styles.digit, styles.d1, etc., etc. And that is also powered by Neato. One of the nice things about sort of being able to define your own framework is you can do whatever you want. And so I'm going to actually go pull up that CSS and just paste it in so we can see it. Copy that right now. Okay, and then down here I can say digit.module.css. I'm just going to paste this in. Not important what this is doing. I'm not even sure I totally understand it. I just copied it from this code pen. Let's make sure the formatting looks good. Yes, there we go. Okay. Now, the way that this works is every time that Neato notices a top level class like this, like digit, it'll turn that into a method and then that maps to this uniqueified CSS selector, or the CSS class, so that all of my CSS classes are scoped to that component. So in digit.rux, I can say styles.digit. This is defined by virtue of the fact there's a digit class here. And then we can say the same thing for stopwatch. So over here, I haven't added this yet, but we can say, I can use the nice class names helper here. And by the way, these curly braces are how you switch to Ruby and how you provide a Ruby value for an HTML attribute. So class names is a helper provided by Neato. I can say styles.stopwatch. And then I can also pass class name in here because we have our class name prop, and this just helps provide this is just a way for the client, whoever's using this component, to pass in extra class names. I think, yeah, I thought I defined a method for this. I guess not. Because I thought, oh no, because it's a prop, right? So the prop is class name, so I can just call it like a method or define or use it like a local variable. Okay, so this will combine these two things together, the class styles.stopwatch and whatever extra classes I'm passing in from the user of this component. And I can also then go define my stopwatch.module.css, and I'll just copy paste that as well. Here we go. And you can see we got our dots here, we got our decimal, like this is just additional CSS. Not important what this is doing. We'll just close those. But just by virtue of the fact that I have got this sort of sidecar file here, stopwatch module CSS, now I can say dot stopwatch because that was one of the classes in there, just to reiterate that. And then instead of saying dots here, right here, I can now say styles rather, dots. Okay. Do the same thing down here. All right, so we are almost ready to see if this works. I'm also going to, in my board component, I'm going to add the board. It's funny, I should have had this before. Add a little border here, so there's a separation between the grid and the countdown stopwatch there. A little bit of padding. I could also have used a stack for this. I mean, if I was doing this for real, I probably would. But again, it's just for research. Okay, so we've got most of the moving parts here. And if you'll recall, we just passed running equals true in here, so that this thing should run right away. So as soon as the page loads, we should see it running. Now, this is some semi-live coding, and I have no idea if this is going to work. So let's restart our server to pick up those new files and see what happens. Oh, we already have a syntax error or something here. What is it complaining about? Okay, so I'm back. I don't know what happened. I just killed the server and restarted it, and everything's fine now, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Anyway, you can see what we have here, though, is we have our, this seems to have worked pretty well. We've got our countdown timer here. We've got the elapsed label. We're missing the border here for some reason. So I will also try to just see if we can restart post CSS. Shouldn't have to do this. I'm not sure why. Oh, I know what's going on. So we also need to, in our board component, we've got this upper div here, and this is what is actually where the board CSS class is supposed to be applied. You can see that I just added this, and I forgot to go back here and add it in here. So we can say class equals styles dot board. And if we refresh this now, hopefully now we'll see that change. Yep, there's our little separator and some padding. Okay, and you also may remember that we also said that we wanted this to start running, and it's not running. Why is that? Well, it's because we haven't actually written that code yet. Let's switch back to stopwatch, and notice that we're not setting a timer or doing anything here. So let's add that functionality now. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is define an onChange handler. So there's also, not only can we refer to props by their method names, in this case init elapsed msex, that's a method, or it looks like a local variable or method, just like you might be expecting in Ruby. And that's provided by Neato, automatically defined for you. There's also this props instance variable, and if we say props.onChange do, whenever props change, this will get invoked. We can say if running, so in other words, if our timer, our stopwatch, should be running, then in other words, this would be true if we flipped from running false to running true. We would want to then start the timer. And what I'm going to show you now is one of the really nice features of Opal, which is that it not only lets us run Ruby in the browser, it also lets us interoperate between Ruby and JavaScript. In JavaScript, most of the ways that you would deal with timers and whatnot can be accomplished by just calling window.setInterval or window.setTimeout. In this case, we're just going to use setInterval. And what I can do here is what window.setInterval will do is return an ID to us. We need to save that ID somewhere. And so we'll say interval ID, and we can just backticks, and this will say, whatever I put in these backticks, I want this to run as if it were just regular old JavaScript. So I can say window.setInterval, and I'm going to pass a function called tick. We haven't written that yet. And then every 100 milliseconds, I want that tick function to get called. And if we are not running, then I want to say if we already are running, so in other words, if we have an ID equals interval, then I want to clear that interval to stop the timer from running. So we'll say window.clear interval ID. Now, you might be wondering, why am I setting a local variable ID equal to my instance variable interval ID? And that's because one sort of interesting, I don't know, quirk or interesting facet of Opal, a transpiled Opal code, is that local variables can be referred to by their names. Instance variables cannot. And so what I'm doing here, in order to be able to access the ID variable in JavaScript land, I also have to set it here in Ruby land, and then those are the same thing. I can reference this ID variable in JavaScript. I can also do the same thing with this tick function here. I'm going to define a tick method, or a tick lambda rather. And what this is going to do, it'll just set state elapsed msex, which is this function that I've defined down here. That's what it's calling, and that's just getting the state of elapsed msex. And I'm going to set that equal to elapsed msex plus 100. So every tick, and that's why we also have the same tick down, the same interval down here. We're incrementing by 100 milliseconds every time this thing gets called, and we should be calling it every 100 milliseconds using set interval down here. So what this means now is that elapsed msex is live, right? It's being updated constantly, and being that it's one of these props here and managed by Neato and therefore managed by Solid, every time it gets updated, it will also update the view. So hopefully that's all we need to do to go refresh our browser and see it running. And look, there it goes. So we've got the whole thing sort of wired up and working in Ruby. We had to write a little tiny bit of JavaScript, which we could totally abstract away at some point if we wanted to. Now, of course, this isn't super useful. We should also make it pause and all that. So let's go add our pause button, and then I think we'll be pretty much done here. So I'm just going to copy paste this code because I think it's pretty obvious how it works at this point. We'll create our pause button.rux, and I will copy paste that code here. Okay. We have an on-click handler that you have to pass in. That's one of the props right here. And when that gets clicked, we want to stop the timer. So we will now go back to our game component, and I'm going to also copy paste this. We want our pause button here to be under the stopwatch because we're arranged in a row stack here. That button will just appear to the right of the stopwatch. And if we go back and refresh, this actually might not work. I'm going to have to restart the server for this. Yes, because we added a new file. Oops, that's CSS. Let's go back to Rails server, restart that. And look, there's our pause button. And if we click on this, nothing happens right now. And that's because we have not defined that pause method. Let's go back to our pause method, or our code here, and we'll go to the pause method. I'm going to copy that and paste that here. And all this is going to do is set our status to idle. And when I need to go back also and copy a different part here, or change this running to true. Now instead of running true, what we want to say is, maybe we'll say running question mark. This will be a method we define here, running question mark. And all running question mark is going to do is just look at our status. Let's see, where is it? There it is. All we want to say is, and that is if status equals running. Okay, so with sort of minimal changes, I would say, we should now be able to click that button and have it pause. Okay, and of course, I guess we want to say, we should probably set our state, just so we can see this happening. We'll set our state to running up here in the initializer. And if we refresh this, it should be running. Yep, and if I hit the pause button, sure enough, it pauses. There's no way to restart it right now. But if we set our state back to running, then by using another button, then that would be another way to do that. What we're going to do instead, though, is wire it up to our, when we press a key here, that should start. In fact, that actually might already be working. Let's check that out. Yeah, that already works. I already wrote that a while ago. Okay, so we've set out to do what we want to do. I'm also going to do the last thing here, which is just to copy and paste a couple of other nice to haves. This is not actually wired up yet. It's going to be a your best time and your streak, just like you might have in the app from Apple, the crossword app. So doing a really similar thing. All I'm doing is I'm just doing another instance of the stopwatch component. I'm setting running to false. In this case, this would normally come from the server, like what was your best time? Again, I haven't wired that up yet. And if I refresh that, though, you can see that that's wrong. There should be stacked on top of each other. I think I probably messed that up in the code here. Let's see what I did here. Yeah, I'm not seeing... Oh, does this need to be... Yes, this needs to be here like this. I need to nest this inside that other stack. Refresh this, we can see then they should be stacked now. Yes, there we go. Okay, so, and we should also go back here and Set this back to idle. And now we have our full application here. I can type like I normally would. I can hit the pause button. If I type again, you can see that it restarts the stopwatch. It starts running again. So we've just implemented that feature in, I would say, a way that I really enjoy writing front end, which is to say most of it's in Ruby, and I was able to wire these things up like I might in a truly component-driven setup. All right, so hopefully that gives you a taste of the kind of things that I'm thinking about. Not that I'm some genius here. I just really want to like push this forward and try to make the Rails front end better and more cohesive. If you have any feedback for me, I'd love to hear it. You can get in touch with me on Mastodon. I am on ruby.social. This is my username, ruby.social/@Camertron. And yeah, hope to hear from you. And thanks so much for watching. This is a long video, so thank you.